a lot of people think of the tree in Eden, they think of the tree you're not supposed to touch, but there's also a whole big garden that this is a part of, that Adam and Eve were able to enjoy, but there was this one that they were supposed to keep away from to show their dependence and trust on God, that God had amply provided for them all this other stuff, and there's this one tree they weren't supposed to touch. We couldn't put a whole garden on stage here, and so the reason why we went with one tree that kind of signified the whole garden, when Adam and Eve went and took that fruit from the tree they weren't supposed to touch, they did damage to the whole of creation, the whole garden. And so we thought we might as well just put those two images one on top of the other, of the kind of the reaching out, taking the fruit that you might expect to happen in a video on Genesis, making that the thing that actually did break creation. And so we decided to kind of overlap those two ideas on top of each other, which I think provides a cool bit of significance. So the satchel represents God's promise to all nations. So after the fall, God made a promise to Adam and Eve that one of their descendants would arise, one of Eve's seed would arrive, who would crush the head of the serpent or death, and would bring them back to the garden with God. And so this satchel is supposed to represent every seed that in God's foreknowledge, he put in Eve's line, all the way leading down to Jesus. And so when you see it, when Jesus turns the satchel over and one seed comes out, he's that final seed that God had foreordained to lead up to him. And so that satchel that gets passed around is God's promise to the specific line of people that we see traced first throughout Genesis and then throughout the rest of the Bible. So yeah, the seed is really important, both to the video and to the book of Genesis. And so the seed is supposed to trace, there's two lineages that come out of Adam and Eve. And one is the seed of the serpent. So that's the seed that's not chosen, the seed that leads to death, the seed that won't repent, the seed that leads to evil. And then there's the seed of the woman that God continues to work through to bring about the promise, no matter how messed up that line actually is. And so as each person pulls out the seed from the satchel, what we're saying to the audience is that is part of God's chosen line. That person's part of God's chosen line. That person's part of God's chosen line. So over and over again we see that, because all throughout the book of Genesis what we see is there are these genealogies that pop up over and over and over again. I think there's almost 10 of them. And what it does is it either shows us, is this line leading to the seed of the serpent, or is this line leading to Jesus, the seed of Eve, who will fix everything? And so we wanted to make sure that we leaned in really hard on that initial promise in Genesis 3:15 that one of Eve's seed would eventually come back and put an end to death. And so that seed's really important as it's traced through Genesis and traced through the video. So yeah, one of my favorite moments in the whole video is at the end, you see Jesus replanting this one seed, which if you're kind of taking in the meaning of everything, that one seed is Jesus, and it is his death, burial, and his resurrection. And he plants that in the ground where, there was death and there was uncreation and there was chaos and mayhem, and it births this new tree. And what that's showing us is this truth that the Bible is bookended by two gardens. And there's the first garden in Eden in the book of Genesis, and everything's broken and it goes into chaos and there's all this turmoil. But then in Revelation at the end, we're back in a garden, and there's not the tree of the knowledge of good and evil anymore. There's the tree of life that originally Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden so they couldn't partake of it. But now it's there for us. And so the good news of the Bible and the whole story the Bible's telling is, how do we get back into the garden with God? And so to begin and end the book of Genesis as it is in this film with a tree shows us the whole story of the Bible in a really short time. It shows us that we're going from a garden to a garden, and that is the whole shape of the Bible, the whole shape of our lives. And then we wanted to make sure that we included everybody else from the video back into the garden. So you have Adam and Eve are there, and Noah's there, and everyone's back from this chosen line are back in the garden with God, because that's the best part of the good news, is that I think it's John Piper wrote a book called God is the Gospel, and his whole thesis of that book is the best part of the good news is that we get God. And so the good news is that we get to live with Jesus. And so the fact is, these people did horrible things throughout their lives, but because of Jesus' grace, because he died on the cross for them, they get to now come back into the place from which they were excluded, and they get to come back and be with the one who's most beautiful and satisfying. And so we love that image of them being back in the garden with God, living with him, and you even see people like kind of tending the soil with him and working the ground with him, because that's ultimately what we'll do. We'll have vocation in heaven. We'll work with him in heaven, alongside him in heaven. And so we wanted to try to like squeeze all that meaning into one final shot. Pretty much everybody every human in the video ends up dropping the satchel at some point that holds the seeds. We try to load that with some meaning, and so what that's supposed to mean is they are walking away from the plan and purpose that God has put into their lives, the reason why they were made, what they were supposed to be doing with their existence, with their chosenness, with them being a part of this royal line, and they abandon it, and they go off to do something lesser, something sinful, something worse. And so the whole point of dropping the satchel is to show that, like, one, that they abandoned what God had planned for them and put in their hands and wanted them to do, but also there's this like drumbeat throughout the whole video that the satchel never gets abandoned. It always gets picked back up, which is to show us that no matter how hard we try to separate ourselves from God and leave behind what he wants for us and leave behind his will for our lives, no matter how many times we drop it, he always has a plan to pick it back up and achieve something for us that we couldn't achieve for ourselves. Yeah, so at the beginning of the video and also then toward the end, we see Jesus in this at this workbench, and there's tools, and you see the trees there, there's wood and branches, and there's all this stuff happening. And basically what we're trying to show there is that the cross and God's plan for the world is happening in eternity past, outside of space and time. That it wasn't that man messed up and sinned and broke the tree and it surprised God, and every time someone did something wrong, he was like, whoa, you're catching me off guard here, or something like that. The whole point is that the tree, the stripped down tree, was actually at Jesus' workbench from the beginning, and the tools that would ultimately lead to his crucifixion were there since the beginning, that he had a plan to fix our brokenness since before the foundations of the world. And so when you see the workbench and you see Jesus working at it, we want the viewer to understand that we're stepping outside of time, we're stepping off the stage of the world and kind of backstage to be with God in his home, in his heavenly dwelling, where there is no space or time, and to show that he is planning and working behind the scenes to bring good out of our evil, even before we did anything good or evil. The Bible loves to talk about those things. So that's what's happening at the workbench. So at the top of the video, we see Jesus turning on the lights and working on the scene and opening the curtain. And I mean, it's a really simple metaphor. We're just trying to show that God is setting the stage for creation. That he's, in the beginning there was, he spoke and there was light, and so he turns on the lights. And there were seed-bearing plants, and so we see a tree. And he opens the curtain and he separates the vault of the sky from the vault of the sea. All these different things. We're trying to play with these different days of creation in the opening, just to kind of hearken us back to Genesis 1 and 2. But all the time that you're seeing those images, you're hearing about the plan of God, which is actually not just about creating the world, it's about creating a stage on which Jesus will die, to show us that God's not just a powerful God who can create. God is a loving and merciful God who wanted to make a world to display his mercy, that he would create this world, he would open these curtains and turn on these lights and plant this tree, ultimately to lead to his own death. And he does that to show us just the utter baffling depths of his love and mercy for us. So there comes this time after everyone's breaking off the branches from the tree, where the tree's just completely barren, and we wanted that to convey this hopelessness. So there's an idea in Christianity called total depravity, and you believe what you want about it, but I think we can all relate to this feeling of utter hopelessness, where we look at our own lives and it looks like there's nothing of value on our tree. There's not even a green leaf left, that there's nothing good that God could possibly look at and be like, oh yeah, you're okay. I kind of like you still. We wanted that moment of utter hopelessness, which I think is a really sober view of the human condition, which is there is nothing on our tree without Jesus. There is nothing green. There is nothing of value. We have stripped off every limb and branch, and we're left bare and naked, with nothing of value to show Jesus. And he says, whenever Jesus comes on the scene, Jesus talks about how whenever I'm going to come and I'm going to look at a tree, and every tree that does not bear fruit, I'm going to throw into the fire. And that's what we deserve. Like we deserve to be tossed aside and destroyed, because we don't do what trees should do. We are stripped bare and we have nothing of value on us. But the amazing thing is Jesus comes and reverses that, and he takes something that's completely bare and he makes it fruitful, and he makes it full of life again, and green and bearing fruit. And that's the gospel. That's death to life. That's a new creation. And so we tried to kind of want to make that really stark distinction between a stripped bare tree and a full tree. So there's this line of people after the fall that kind of all get their chance to grab the satchel and get a seed, but end up breaking off a bit of the tree. And this line of people is supposed to show us basically the whole arc of Genesis, and Genesis's obsession with following this line of Eve's family, this preserved line that would ultimately lead to Jesus. And so what you see in this line is you see the history of Israel, starting with Adam and Eve, and then Cain and Abel, and then Seth, Sarah, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and that's where it ends, is with Joseph. And when Joseph finally gets there, he comes up and does his thing. He's got the satchel and the seed, but he ends up, he wasn't perfect. We don't really get a lot of record of Joseph's sin, but we know that he wasn't perfect, because he wasn't the promised one who ended death. We know he did sin, and so he breaks off that final branch, and then that satchel is just left there with a barren tree with no one to pick it up. And that's supposed to kind of give us this image of what we should feel at the end of Genesis, because at the end of Genesis, they are farther from Eden than they've ever been. They are not a multitude of people like they thought they were going to be. They're 70 in all, and that's not the 70 is not even Jacob's children. Some are slaves, some are wives, and things like that. And then when you turn the page to Exodus, they've been there for 400 years. And so it's like, who's going to come up and pick up the satchel and continue the line to get us this final seed will end death? And so there's that moment after the line is expended where it's like, man, who's going to pick up this promise? And that's kind of what you feel as you read through the Old Testament, is like, is anybody going to pick up this satchel and actually finish this line? And Jesus finally does and comes, which is why Matthew and Luke start their Gospels with genealogies. It's picking up where this line left off. And so it's supposed to kind of give us that feeling of the line never ended. If it could, it would have gone on forever and led to Jesus. So that's the deal with the line. So toward the beginning of the video, you see this kind of quick shot of Jesus taking a bowl and pouring the seeds into the satchel. And you might have just been like, yeah, he's got to get those seeds in the satchel somehow. But for us, it's a pretty intentional thing that in eternity past on Jesus' workbench, there's these seeds in a bowl. And we like to think that he picked them and put them there, and that those are intentional, that this would be the line of people that he would use to lead to Jesus. And so when he puts them in the satchel and seals it up, it's done. Like the job is over, the choice has been made, evil cannot win, our mess-ups cannot win. Jesus has done it all and has put it in this satchel, sealed up as a promise. And so it's just that assurity, that just assurance that no matter what we do to mess it up, God's going to bring good out of it, because he's already put all the plans and the seeds to begin with. So that's kind of that quick shot actually has quite a bit of meaning for us. So when Adam and Eve sin, and when everybody else sins throughout the whole video, we picture that by them coming up to the tree and breaking off a branch. And that, for us, that's a really intentional choice. We were trying to decide, how do we show sin? How do we show rebellion? And so the way we tried to do that was to show its effects. And so what sin does is it operates antithetically and opposite to God's intent for creation. And so it takes something that God made that's good, right? This tree is good. Eden was good. The garden was good. And the point of a tree is not to break it or harm it or dismember it. That's not what these things are for. And any sin is taking something good that God's given us and warping it into a way, in such a way that it makes it wrong and it distorts it. And what it ends up doing is it breaks down God's world. And that's why, so that's why there's so much hurt and pain and brokenness in the world, is because of sin, that people continue to take the good things that God's put in this world and use them in wrong ways. And so that's what we wanted to represent, that through sin being this breaking off of these branches, is we get to see the effect is that sin breaks God's world, which makes the gospel so much better, that Jesus, when he comes, does not just forgive us of breaking the world, right? He gave Adam and Eve their seeds again. Like that's forgiveness. Like I forgive you, come and do what I wanted you to do in the first place. But he also fixes the effects of their brokenness. So like when justice is done in a court of law or something, a judge can say guilty and condemn that man or that woman to a proper sentence, jail time or what have you. But that doesn't fix the heart of those people who were hurt or sinned against or had violence done against them. And it doesn't, if there was a murder or something, that doesn't bring their loved one back to life. But Jesus is so much better than just justice and just mercy. He also fixes things that are broken. He takes the effects of sin and puts them back together. He brings us back to a garden where everything's healed and everything's whole again.